Today's video is going to focus on the causes, strengths, weaknesses, and results of the Articles of Confederation, the first effort at a federal system of government in the United States. Before we get into the strengths and weaknesses, it is important to put this document in context. What was going on in the United States leading up to the creation of the Articles of Confederation? Remember that the war was fought in part to eliminate what the Patriots considered the tyrannical overstepping of the British government. They believed their rights were being violated, and the reason for this was centralized leadership that did not consider the needs of the people. In the process, the concept of taxation was demonized, meaning that the idea that money and resources should be turned over to the government for the common good was not looked upon quite simply as a good thing, and this would lead to the most obvious and problematic weakness of the Articles of Confederation, the lack of taxation. The new national government consisted only of a Congress. It is not surprising that they would avoid any kind of centralized figure such as a king or a president, because the English king had become the symbol of all that is wrong with dictatorship. If power was in the hands of one, they believed, it would become tyrannical. There was no judicial branch either, so all legal issues were decided by state courts. Each state had only one vote in Congress, regardless of how populated the state was. You needed 9 of 13 states to pass a law, and all 13 states needed to agree in order to amend or change the articles. And all taxation was done by the states. The Congress had no power to tax, and therefore the central government had no money. The system was based on the idea that if power was spread out amongst many, it would not become oppressive. But Americans soon began to realize that oppressive tyranny was not the only weakness a government could have. First, let's consider the basic roles of most governments. For most governments, its primary responsibility is to protect its people from foreign and domestic threats. Put simply, protect against people from inside or outside the country attempting to overthrow the government or hurt its people. Another purpose of government is to regulate trade and protect property owners. A more controversial role of government is whether or not it should protect citizens from economic problems. But any way you look at it, the Articles of Confederation failed on these fronts. The fact that it took so many states to agree to anything prolonged the process of passing laws. And the fact that you couldn't tax made it virtually impossible to enforce those laws. So the Congress was virtually powerless. So, if the Congress was so powerless, who was powerful? Essentially, the answer is the individual state governments. This was the point of the Articles. States would be closer to the people and therefore less tyrannical. But without a federal government overseeing the states, states became too powerful. For example, states started taxing each other. For example, Massachusetts might say that if a Rhode Islander wanted to buy a product made in Massachusetts, that Rhode Islander would have to pay a tax. Then Rhode Island would simply start taxing products made in Massachusetts. A taxing war might ensue, and there was no one to regulate it. Individual states passed contradictory laws, with no one to regulate when those laws might violate individual rights. Without a president, other countries were not sure who to negotiate treaties with. Negotiating treaties with states seemed pointless because even if you could hammer out an agreement, there was no guarantee it would apply to each state. The Treaty of Paris that ended the war was not being enforced because there was no national enforcement agency or even law that could be passed to force people to comply. However, many Americans were still reluctant to try again. The fear of tyrannical dictatorship ran deep. The wake-up call was an event called Shays' Rebellion. In Massachusetts, a group of war veterans were angry that their homes were being foreclosed upon. These people were counting on being paid for their service once the war was over, but instead they were being taxed heavily by the government of Massachusetts. Massachusetts instead chose to pay back those who contributed financially to the war rather than those who contributed militarily. This group of veterans decided to storm the courthouse and committed many acts of violence. The rebellion was barely put under control by the state militia, but it was clear that without an army or an ability to collect taxes, the Congress was unable to protect its own people or collect taxes that could be used to pay back debts, like those that were owed to the soldiers who began Shays' Rebellion. This event would tip the scales, and it became clear a new American government had to be created. It is important to point out, however, that while Congress was quite weak, it did manage to solve one important problem faced by the new nation. The territory in between the Mississippi River and the Appalachian Mountains now belonged to the United States. The states immediately started to claim specific areas within these territories as an expansion of their state. But these claims were overlapping. Multiple states claimed the same territory. The Congress was able to negotiate a solution. Essentially, the agreement was instead to create new states. The original states were placated because it meant that these new states would likely be populated by people from the adjacent state. For example, Virginians would likely move to Kentucky, a newly created state, doubling the influence that Virginians would have in Congress once Kentucky was made into a state. With a new policy called the Northwest Ordinance, in order to entice people to settle, they promised rights such as trial by jury and other rights that would eventually be codified into the Bill of Rights. Additionally, the Northwest Territory outlawed slavery to ensure new settlers they would not be competing with wealthy slave owners for resources. These agreements managed to avoid major conflict, perhaps even a civil war. So yeah, the Articles were not a total disaster, and it was understandable that Americans wanted to avoid the worst abuses that can be suffered under a dictatorship. But it is also clear that the Articles of Confederation was a dangerously designed government. Without centralized power existing somewhere, chaos could easily ensue.